And you can see in the bottom left here, they're actually pretty decent size. This little guy got captured and banded. Interestingly, these guys actually will sort of perform this mobbing behavior if there's a predator in the area, and that's usually how they will actually catch them and then band them. So they'll lure them in with like an owl decoy. And here are those similar species I was talking about. You probably won't see a Mexican jay around here. They're a little bit further south, but it's definitely possible to see one of these western scrub jays. So the difference again with these guys is a longer tail and a more pronounced white throat, and their bellies are generally lighter colored. They're not sort of that uniform dusky blue. They're a little bit brighter blue. So just a little bit about the Piñon Jay, some natural history. They're in the family Corvidae, which include jays, crows, ravens, magpies, and nutcrackers. And you guys may have heard that ravens and crows are especially smart. They actually can use tools and stuff to solve problems. And the Piñon Jay is a highly social bird. They form these year-round flocks. They don't migrate. And actually, the young will stay in the flock that they were born into generally for their whole lives. Their diet consists of nuts and insects, but it weighs pretty heavily on those pinyon nuts. The breeding season is in early March, and they generally form monogamous partnerships between the males and the females. So they form these nesting colonies that can actually be really big. 57 hectares or like a quarter of a square mile. And they generally show like a high site fidelity. That means that they'll return to the same colony site year after year. They are obligate mutualists with pinyon pines. And they have a pretty large home range, so 4,000 hectares or 15 square miles. Generally, like for one flock, it can cover that distance, and they'll move up and down in elevation with seasons. And they cache pinyon nuts up to like a few miles away. They actually have been known to have like thousands of different caches of these pinyon nuts. It's pretty amazing to me that they can remember where they put them all. General habitat requirements. Piñon jays thrive in these sort of edge habitats. So on the right here, you can kind of see from the perspective of who took this photo, they're up in the forest, but we have sort of a transitional zone going down into a prairie. And so they forage along these edge habitats, and they'll cache seeds in sort of more sparse areas, and they generally nest in very dense areas. So having a thick area next to like a sparse area is really beneficial for these guys. Another thing is the varied forest age. Generally, their nesting colonies are found in areas with a high proportion of old growth, large pinyon trees. And this could be for a few reasons, but it's most likely because these are the most productive pinyon trees when they do actually produce nuts. And they form this clumped nesting behavior, these colonies I spoke about, where they'll actually congregate near an emergence of pinyon nuts in the pinyon trees. So some potential predators that they have to deal with, pretty much general predators for nesting birds, snakes, sharp-shinned hawks, Cooper's hawks, owl species, including spotted owls, feral cats, raccoons, ravens, and foxes, just to name a few. I'm sure there are more. One interesting behavior that they will display, well, actually, I guess two interesting behaviors here. So they'll actually position a few members of the flock up high in the trees to sort of serve as sentinels. So you can think of like a meerkat colony or something like that. And they'll alert the rest of the colony, the rest of the flock when there's a predator around. And then generally, they'll try to scare it off using this mobbing behavior. And here you can see them chasing away a frightened red-tailed hawk. Now, why are we talking about Piñon jays here? So they've actually experienced the worst decline of any US bird species over the last 50 years. This culminates in a 3.69 decrease per year with an overall population loss of about 83.5%. So that's pretty substantial. And then moving forward, some scientists have predicted that we will lose another 50% of what is remaining over the next 19 years. They're listed as vulnerable on the red list of threatened species by the IUCN. So you'll see things like rhinos and lions and stuff like that, that the IUCN tries to manage. And here within the US, the US Fish and Wildlife Service has listed them as a priority species. So that basically just means that they're kind of considered for listing at this point. So they're not actually listed as threatened or endangered. And so I'm sorry, this is a little bit grainy here, but if you kind of zoom into where we are and you know, around the Canyon City, Salida area, we can see that that has experienced a greater than 1.5% decrease per year. There are some spots that have shown us a slight increase in Piñon Jay populations. And these areas are generally sort of really remote areas where there isn't a lot of active management happening. So let's talk about pinyon pines a little bit. Here's a nice big one. This one would produce a whole lot of seeds or nuts. And here's the Piñon Jay range, or I'm sorry, the pinyon pine range in the upper right, and a nice little cone with some seeds in it in the lower right. So these trees can get up to about 1 meter in diameter, which is pretty large, up to 56 feet tall. Their cones are 1.5 inches to 2 inches long, and they usually will contain anywhere from 10 to 20 seeds per cone. If you're out there trying to identify one, the needles are maybe 1/2 inch to 2 inches long and in fascicles of 2. So that just means, as you can kind of see here, the needles form bunches of 2. So that's one way that scientists identify different pine species from each other. These guys are pretty amazing. They can live up to 1,000 years. That's very rare, I would say. It's generally limited by severe fire outbreaks. And then so every 3 to 7 years, they produce these massive, it's called a mast event, M-A-S-T, every 3 to 7 years. And like I said, the Piñon Jays will actually kind of nest and clump around these emergence events. And this has been shown to be limited by water availability, but also temperature, which I'll talk about in a little while too. It's one of the most calorie-dense foods found in nature, actually. So like a cup of piñon nuts actually contains almost 1,000 calories. So piñon pines are also ecosystem engineers. If you've ever been out in the woods in like a piñon juniper habitat, you probably noticed that that's really the only 2 tree species that are around. So they generally kind of tend to take over. And these seeds that they do produce provide food for all kinds of wildlife. Just to name a few, obviously our charismatic Piñon Jay here. Mule deer, elk will eat them too. This is a Clark's nutcracker. And then a pinyon tip borer moth. So insect life also depends on these pine trees pretty heavily. So then if we move into a pinyon pine ecosystem, what happens when you put a bunch of them together in one spot? Well, let's take a step back. So around 15,000 years ago, we had the Wisconsinian glaciation event. So you can see here the Laurentide ice sheet moved down pretty far. It didn't reach Colorado, but that doesn't mean that it didn't change the climate around here. So at that time, this glaciation event sort of pushed pinyon juniper habitat down into lower elevations. So places like the deserts of Texas, the Chihuahuan Desert, the Mojave, and the Sonoran deserts. And then starting around 13,000 years ago, when the climate began to warm back up, pinyon pine trees in this whole ecosystem started to move back up the mountain. So here we have a pinyon ecosystem. You can see some juniper interspersed in there. It's a very drought-adapted ecosystem, and these trees are wind-pollinated, so they're probably responsible for some of the allergies that you guys get. So the mean annual precipitation is only 7 to 25 inches, so that's really not very much. And like I mentioned before, they experience these stand-replacing crown fires every 200 to 400 years. So generally, there's not a lot of ladder fuels around, so that just means like branches that could be dead branches that transfer the fire from one tree to another. These crown fires are very severe and they kill the whole forest. So here's another picture of a pinyon ecosystem. Generally, these occur from 4,500 to 7,500 feet, experiencing mean annual temperatures of about 40 to 61 degrees Fahrenheit. And they're adapted to rocky, sandy, and clay soils. they rely on Piñon jays basically exclusively to disperse their seeds around. And if we did experience a really severe crown fire, so a stand replacing fire in these ecosystems, there's really not much that would disperse the seeds besides something like a Piñon jay. And interestingly, Piñon habitat has actually increased in its overall range over the last 100 years. And I'll talk more about this in a second, but the issue falls that we're sort of creating these really young stands of Piñon. So as you can see here, these trees are all pretty small. So they're probably not producing a whole lot of mast or food for things like Piñon jays. Just a quick aside for evolutionary ecology. This is what I think these things are super interesting. So like I mentioned, the Piñon jays are a very social bird. And we think that they probably evolved this behavior for two reasons. Like I mentioned, the predator defense, so mobbing predators and keeping them away from their nests, but also in response to Piñon mast events. Like I said, every 3 to 7 years, these Piñon trees produce a huge crop of food. So it makes sense that Piñon jays have evolved to sort of gather around those sources of food. And so your favorite ecological interaction, mutualisms, we have a couple examples here. So you guys are probably familiar with clownfish and sea anemones. So the sea anemones can sting predatory fish to keep the clownfish safe. And the clownfish sort of eat little microscopic predators that would be feeding on the sea anemone. Pollination is another really good example. Here's a monarch butterfly with a caterpillar on a milkweed plant. So along with other insects, the monarchs pollinate milkweed plants. And here's an interesting one too. You see this with birds on wildebeests and elephants. But this one's taking a pretty big risk here being in the mouth of this alligator. So he's in there cleaning up his teeth. So the alligator benefits by having a clean mouth. And the bird benefits by getting a little snack. So one hypothesis I wanted to sort of mention is this Jansen-Connell hypothesis. And it states, if pests are host specific, then pests will reduce recruitment where hosts are most abundant, freeing up space for other plant species. So basically that's really just saying, and I'll show you a graphic here in a minute, but that's really just saying that it's harder for a tree of the same species to grow near a bunch of the same species of trees. So if they grow really close to the mother tree, they're more susceptible to herbivory, disease transmission, and actually the resource competition with their parent tree because they use the same exact nutrient profile from the soil. So here's a graphic representation of this Jansen-Connell hypothesis. So there's a little bit going on here, so I'll kind of walk you through it slowly. So here's the idea that here's the parent tree. They're limited in the distance that they can actually disperse their seeds. So different trees, different plants have different methods of getting their seeds sort of far away from themselves. So as you get further away from the tree, it's less likely that a seed will actually end up there. And if you're really close to the tree, you have high resource competition, like I mentioned in the soil, like the nutrient profiles, and then low resource competition as you get further away. And this line here is illustrating that the probability of seedling survival increases the further away from the mother tree that it is. So we end up with this butter zone here, sort of intermediate distance from the parent tree, which is generally referred to as the recruitment curve. So how does this fit into Piñon pines and Piñon jays, you might ask? Well, Piñon jay seed dispersal, like I mentioned before, they can actually carry seeds and cache them, multiple miles away. So they're sort of aiding in propagating Piñon forests on the landscape. And just to sort of hammer this point home, these two pictures here are illustrating the Piñon pine range on the left and the Piñon jay range on the right. And I probably don't really have to explain that they're pretty similar. So like I said, Piñon jays are an obligate mutualist, which means that they need Piñon pines in order to survive. And just a little bit about Piñon jay reproduction. So they really do rely on Piñon pines. interestingly, most birds initiate their breeding season based on photoperiod. So that's just day length. So like a certain time every year. The day length generally doesn't change. But Piñon jays, interestingly, can actually sort of ramp up and kick into reproductive mode if, say, there was like a late mast year from pinyon pines, which is really interesting. That's pretty unusual. So their fertility and reproductive success, it's been shown multiple times that they're higher in years of pinyon pine mast production, which is pretty interesting. So, that's to me just illustrating like a really strong connection between these two species. And like I mentioned, they are the main long distance seed dispersers for pinyon pines. So where are we today in this pinyon juniper ecosystem? There's been an overall reduction in habitat quality. So I'll talk about this a little bit more. But like I mentioned, interestingly, the pinyon juniper ecosystem is actually covering more space than it used to, but the quality of that habitat is lower. Think back to that slide I showed with all of the young, similarly aged pinyon trees. And this has sort of resulted from extensive thinning for grazing in the 1900s to just create habitat for cattle to graze, more or less. And juniper trees are presenting a pretty big problem for managing pinyon habitat. They grow a little bit faster, they're a little bit more drought adapted, and they produce more seeds every year, whereas a pinyon might only produce seeds every 7 years. Junipers generally are pretty loaded with those little purple berries every year. So they're sort of encroaching on pinyon habitat. Even though they have historically occurred together, they're sort of starting to take over. Now, thinning is something that I'm going to talk about a lot here, but it's incentivized. Not that this is bad by any means, but so as managers will go out there and thin forests to sort of increase the density of things like forbs and grasses for big game to eat, especially in their winter range, which happens to be in pinyon juniper habitat. And then more recently, we've been thinning for fire mitigation, which you guys are probably no stranger to. So generally, that's a pretty big pressure on land management agencies to sort of reduce fuel loads and reduce the risk of a severe fire. An interesting one is the sage grouse over near Gunnison. And unfortunately, this is an example of where we sort of are finding ourselves pitting two species that need help against each other. So I think like 600,000 acres of pinyon juniper habitat was thinned specifically to try to get more sagebrush to grow over on the western slope there. So they're creating sage grouse habitat, but maybe unknowingly harming the pinyon jay. Climate change is a pretty interesting one. It's obviously a huge issue, multiple facets, but generally there's an increased variability of weather events. And it's been shown a few times that this increased variability, so things like prolonged drought or prolonged wet periods, can actually increase the severity and frequency of bark beetle outbreaks. And the specific beetle that preys on pinyon trees is this Ips beetle here to the right. And additionally, so sort of think back to that glaciation slide that I showed, warming temperatures is starting to call lower elevation stands. So, organisms, including trees, have been shifting their ranges for millions of years since the beginning of life on Earth, pretty much to sort of adapt to climatic change. The issue is that the change is happening at a faster rate than it used to. And generally, unfortunately, there's a negative effect of most habitat management on pinyon jays from what we know now. Here's another example of an even-aged forest stand. So like I mentioned before, there's not a lot of huge trees in here that are really going to produce a big mast for pinyon jays. And this is the sort of ecosystem that you'll end up with if you go out there and do like a clear-cut thinning project or something like that to reduce fuel loads for fire mitigation. An interesting study, Redmond et al. 2012, sort of kind of staying with that climate change theme here. They found that they compared 2 decades, so a decade in the 70s and a decade in the early 2000s, and they found that pinion mast decreased by 40%. And they also measured a bunch of temperature variables and precipitation variables and stuff to try to explain why this could have happened. And interestingly, they sort of deduced that the seed cone production was highly correlated with late summer maximum temperatures. And so the late summer turns out to be the time when pinyon pines sort of initiate growing their cones after they become pollinated. So, and the declines that they saw in this cone production were greatest among populations that experienced the greatest increases in growing season temperatures. And these generally occurred at higher elevations that were cooler to begin with. There's kind of a lot going on here, but this is that study that I was just talking about. Basically, these 9 plots are just different sites. And what they're illustrating is the seed cone production, so the mean cones per branch, and then the mean late summer temperature on the x-axis here. So as you can kind of see, and then so the 2008 decade is red and the 1970 decade is blue. Pretty much across the board, we see a decrease in mast production with increasing temperature. So for both decades. And this was the increased mean temperature at the end of the summer when the pinyon pines are starting to initiate that cone growing sequence. So then moving into Piñon Jay population declines. Like I mentioned, they have experienced the worst decline in the last 50 years of any species that we've been looking at. So, I mean, that's pretty alarming. So on the left, you can see there's a range wide. So think of that Piñon Jay range slide, just the Southwest US. And it's a pretty steep decline. So, you know, that's illustrating that 83.5% decline across their range all the way up until 2015. And unfortunately, this trend is pretty much the same in Colorado, decreasing by 3.6% annually. And like I mentioned before, we think that this is mostly due to decreasing habitat quality. Some other hypothesized reasons for this decline that we are sort of seeing are these clear-cut treatments. So here's an example of a fuels mitigation treatment where they go out and actually just mow down all the trees and then rake up the brush and burn it. And this results in an overall reduction of the stand age and the variation in the age. So, you know, and if you picture this spot in 50 years, it'll probably be a bunch of small pinyon trees. And climate change just is, as I just showed you, we think disrupting the historic mast year cycles that these Piñon Jays have evolved with for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years. And generally the homogenization of these forests, so creating, you know, even-aged young forest stands, seems to be a pretty big issue. Here's just some more examples of treatments. This is over by Texas Creek, where we might go to a field trip here in February. But that was a similar thing where we went in and cleaned up some dense pinyon and juniper and piled up the branches and trees and burned them. This is sort of what it looks like on the ground. This is pretty extreme. You can see a bulldozer back here kind of knocking down these nice big pinyons. They drag chains around to sort of remove the smaller brush as well. And again, this is just for fire mitigation, generally that and cattle grazing. And then in the bottom right here is a hand thinning treatment that we actually did in Booger Red, if you guys are familiar with that area. But this is actually a really nice habitat for Piñon Jays. You can see this nice edge here. And there are some pretty nice sized trees in there as well. So that's definitely a little bit less intensive of a habitat treatment compared to the bulldozers. Like I mentioned, so the occupancy, and when we talk about different metrics to measure how a population is doing through time, occupancy just refers to the probability that they'll be in a certain area. It's not necessarily like a density measurement. So this study in 2019 found that local occupancy of Piñon jays decreased within thinned Piñon juniper stands in central Colorado. Similarly, in New Mexico, they looked at pretty much the same dynamic, and they found that reductions in tree density led to the avoidance of nesting in those treated areas. However, the jays still nested right next door if there was a nice dense stand left over. So that kind of brings us to our field study. We had heard CPW and at the Wildlife Society meetings and stuff, people were starting to talk about Piñon jays. And the Royal Gorge Field Office down in Canyon City consists of mainly Piñon juniper habitat. So we wanted to try to get in there and get involved and see, what kind of data we could collect so we could try to manage these habitats more effectively. And little to none of this habitat has been surveyed historically for Piñon jays. To my knowledge, the first time that anyone went out there and actually looked for these birds was in 2019. CPW did a small study. So the wildlife team at the RGFO, like I said, we kind of want to find out what's really going on with these Piñon jays and hopefully inform these sorts of management actions like thinning. So how do we do that? There's a few published studies out there that provided some protocols for a Piñon jay monitoring study. So we sort of pieced those together. And last fall, we established a study, and the goals were to provide baseline occupancy estimates across our field office, and also identify the forest characteristics within nesting colonies. So things like, forest density, tree size, mast year, things like that. And also compare these areas, or sort of make a comparison between treated areas and untreated areas, and compare nesting success and Piñon jay occupancy in those areas, with the goal again of informing management practices. So just some quick methods. We established 50 10 by 10 kilometer cells, and the protocol is to sample 4 points within each of these cells with an acoustic call, and that's actually the same call that I played for you guys before. So we'll just go out there and play that call in each direction, wait a few minutes, wait for a response, and generally try to, when we're doing that, position ourselves somewhere where we can see a long ways and where we think the sound is being broadcast broadly across the landscape. And the plan in the spring is to revisit these cells 2 additional times each season. And that allows us to calculate the detectability of these species instead of just the occupancy. So this idea of repeated visits. And these surveys take place from sunrise until 10:30 a.m. And that's generally when Piñon jays are most active. This is our study area. This should look familiar to you guys. Here's Fremont County and Chaffee County. This green here is a Piñon juniper habitat across our field office. And we identified this using satellite imagery. And then on the right, the same habitat, but now we've dropped these 10 by 10 kilometer cells and randomly selected 50 of them from this overall sample. This also illustrates areas where thinnings have been enacted as land management practices, generally to reduce fuel load. So you can see we will go all the way down to Huerfano County as well. So one really important part of this study that we're going to try to do is to characterize the microsite where these jays are making their nests. So you can see this guy's tucked in real nice there in a juniper tree. So when we're going out there and we play the calls and we do find a nest, we'll actually make an effort to measure the characteristics of that general area. And we'll do that at 2 scales. So at the scale of the colony on the landscape, and remember this can cover a pretty large area, like 60 hectares, I believe. And so we'll sort of analyze the forest characteristics at that level and also at the level of the nest site. So specifically like the very small area where the tree is and what's around that tree where the nest has been built. And some of these variables that we're going to measure will be tree density, the diameter at the root collar. And this is a little bit different if any of you guys have ever done any forestry work. It's usually diameter at breast height, but since pinyon trees are really, they have a lot of branches, it's sometimes pretty hard to get into the actual trunk of the tree. And you tend to miss a lot of that biomass by doing a breast height measurement on a pinyon tree. The understory coverage and composition, so what kind of plants are there, and then the presence or absence of brown or green pinyon cones to sort of get an idea of the mast production or the past mast production as well. And here's another nest example. You can see it's pretty protected in here. I think, they're kind of trying to hide at that point. The females stay on the nest until the eggs hatch, actually. So the males will kind of bring them food from that monogamous pair. So the habitat characteristics at the nest sites and colonies will be compared to random points. And I'll show you a little diagram here in a second. But so we're going to take these measurements at the nest tree, and then we're going to drop 10 random points around the nest tree, and then compare these habitat variables that I mentioned between the random points and then the nest tree to see if there's anything that we can sort of sift out that would be indicative of why that Piñon Jay made a nest in that specific tree. So here's that graphic. So if we have a nest tree, we'll then drop these 10 random points and collect habitat variables and compare them to the variables that we measured at the nest site. Just a few more examples of Piñon Jay nests. As you can see, it's pretty protected in here. This is in a nice big pinyon tree. Here are some actual eggs. I did not take this picture, but they're super pretty. So moving forward, future direction and what can we do about all this? Unfortunately, based on what we know now, it's probable that the fuels reduction efforts that we've done at the RGFO impacted Piñon Jay nesting activity by changing the forest structure, so the age structure, the size of the trees. But the good news is, the bright spot is that, we'll be able to make beneficial adjustments when we can sort of understand the specific drivers of like habitat variables that cause them to select a specific nest site. And like I mentioned, this is the first big effort in Colorado to really measure Piñon Jay occupancy on a large scale. So obtaining this region-specific information about how our land management practices are impacting this species, it will be very important moving forward, so we can sort of try to adapt these practices to lessen the impacts. So the spatiotemporal variation of negative impacts, we can better understand that by getting a few years of data, and then at multiple scales, like at the colony scale or at the nest tree scale, or at like our field office scale. And examining occupancy will provide information on these processes, these large landscape scale processes. And like I said, the fine scale nest site will help us to really dial in, what we're doing as far as managing these habitats actively for things like fuel reduction. So, if I was going to recommend what somebody should do if they have a lot of pinyon juniper habitat around, we really got to just try to determine a baseline occupancy within these home ranges. Within conservation biology broadly, this is probably the biggest issue, is that, we generally only take notice of something after it's taken a huge nosedive, right? So the earlier we can get the baseline occupancy, the more accurately we can assess the changes into the future. And then trying to further understand these climatic and land use effects on the actual forest dynamics. So, age structure and things like that. So, and I think it's really interesting. My hunch, nobody really knows what's going on, but my hunch is that the declines are tied to maybe an increased variability in the mast dynamics of pinyon trees caused by climate change. So if you think back to that 9-panel graph I showed you, they found that hotter temperatures late in the summer negatively impacted the ability for pinyon trees to actually produce a large mast. And because of things we know, like pinyon jays will actually selectively form their colonies around these big mast events. You know, they're intimately tied together, I guess. And really, you know, the most important thing, like what are on the ground steps that we could do when we're out there as land managers and we're thinking about doing a fuels reduction project or something like that. Generally, we would go out there and survey for jays and their nest sites and place probably at minimum like a 500-meter buffer around any nest site that we did find, and especially not do these treatments during their actual breeding season. Piñon jays have been known to vacate their entire colony, actually, if they're disturbed heavily enough, which, as I'm sure you know, could have a huge effect on their population going forward, because they can nest in groups of, you know, hundreds of birds. So when we do go out there and do these thinning practices, it would be better to sort of implement like a non-uniform thinning. So leaving habitat patches, leaving these huge old growth trees that produce a whole lot of pinyon cones, and leaving some of that edge habitat that I was talking about as well. So to sort of kind of wrap up and just a little summary here, you know, unfortunately, pinyon jays have experienced one of the worst declines in the US over the past 50 years. So, you know, 83.5% of your population is a pretty big chunk. This trend is likely due to land use changes such as fire suppression and mitigation, and climate change affecting forest age structure and pinyon mast events as well. So temperature variations, specifically high temperatures in late summer, can negatively affect this pinyon mast. And future efforts should consider the fine scale habitat characteristics that drive pinyon jays to pick certain spots, and also to see if we can correlate, you know, the larger scale forest type with their survival. So land managers in general, which I guess includes me, I would recommend that we consider altering habitat treatments. Like I mentioned, definitely not during their nesting period, and really trying to retain these productive old growth trees where possible. And they're very hard to find, but there are a few pinyon stands that are old growth and they exhibit old growth characteristics. And interestingly, they're pretty sparsely, I guess it's not that dense. So, you know, there's a fair distance between each tree. So there aren't a lot of small trees popping up. And so this is kind of a graphic I put together to try to maybe explain, you know, the effects that we're sort of measuring on pinyon jay survival and reproduction. So there's a lot going on here, but I'll kind of try to walk you through it. So habitat management, things we do, thinning, fire mitigation, that can feed into the habitat structure. So the size of the trees, the density of the trees, also the forest dynamics and function. And climate change, so temperature, precipitation, and the timing of these events. So like I mentioned before, the huge issue for species when they're trying to adapt to this changing climate, or any changing climate, you know, it's been changing for forever, but we're seeing like a very large variability in the timing of events. So sort of deviating from the norm. And these events, the severity of them also is changing quite a bit. So as we saw, that can feed into pinyon mast dynamics, which in turn feeds into that forest dynamics and function. So, you know, think of how many pinyon trees are being planted by pinyon jays out there. And these things in turn feed into pinyon jay survival and reproduction. And just to really drive home this point, it's likely a human-caused decline. You know, we might not know exactly why. We have sort of identified a few trends that could potentially explain the decrease in Piñon Jay populations that we're observing. But obviously, we're causing a rapid change in the climate, and that's affecting us, which might be a little bit harder of a problem to tackle than actually altering our habitat management. So, when we're really thinking about what we can do, like I said, getting managers to consider altering their land use or their management practices just slightly temporally, so not during their breeding season, and doing surveys for Piñon Jays before they do that could then, feed all the way into Piñon Jay survival and reproduction. And then lastly, what can you do about this? Unfortunately, not a lot, unless you have like a whole bunch of land. Then you could potentially manage for these really old growth, varied age Piñon stands. What you can do though is just support the efforts to monitor them, talk about it, educate people on Piñon Jays and their habitat needs. And with that, I'll talk about our potential field trip that we're going to have here Saturday, February 20th. I showed you a picture actually of this spot earlier in the presentation, but hopefully we're going to go out there and I'll join you guys with audio caller and see if we can actually see some of these individuals. And that's starting to get into their breeding season, so hopefully they'll be active and hopefully that we can see them. And I believe you can buy tickets for that on GARNA's website. So just to thank you again to GARNA and putting this together. There's my contact information if anybody wants to get a hold of me, has more questions. And yeah, with that, I guess I'll take any questions that you guys do have.
Thank you, Jordan. That was awesome. And I know when the screen got clearer, I was able to focus much better on everything I was seeing.
Okay.
Everyone felt the same. Wow, that was really informative. There have been some awesome questions coming through while you were wrapping up there. So I want to start with Daniel Smith. If you scroll up in your chat a little bit, he says, what are those spikes in the Colorado jay population declines? So I noticed those too every so often. It, as going down, and then there were some spikes. So maybe you can talk about that, and then I'll let you just take on this list from there.
Okay, let me just find that question real quick. What are those spikes in the population decline? So let me go to that slide real quick. Yeah, so I should have mentioned this, but the solid lines are 95% confidence intervals around each of these dots. So each of these dots is like a measurement per year. And then in this year in particular, I would guess, I don't have any evidence for this. I would have to dig into a little bit, but I would guess this was probably following like a big mast year from pinyon trees, or maybe like a favorable climate for fledgling success. But since there's a lower sample size in the Colorado study here, like range wide, there are just more sites that they looked at. These small variations in the mean estimates of occupancy per year are, I guess, pretty able to be perturbed, or changes, I guess, are more noticeable because there's just a lower sample size, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Great, thanks for that, Jordan. And going down, the next question is from Jean and Polly. I might just ask you to unmute, Jean and Polly, if you aren't already. Just to clarify this question for us, what are the major reasons for Piñon Jay forest treatment, forage or livestock, fire prevention? Do you want to say a little bit more about that, Jean and Polly? Let's see if I can unmute them, or if they're available. Okay, well, go ahead if you want to try to answer that, and we'll just see if maybe they're just listening in.
Okay, yeah. So the major reasons for forest treatment. Definitely livestock and fire prevention. So more so, in the 1900s when the cattle boom kind of happened, and there was just a huge expansion of that industry. There were a lot of efforts to clear that pinyon juniper habitat because it occurs in these lower elevations that are a little bit more flat unless you're in a canyon, that are more productive for things like grass and forbs, things that cows like to eat. So it was just kind of like a low hanging fruit to sort of expand their rangeland back in the day. Not saying that doesn't happen now. I mean, especially on private land. I don't believe the BLM would ever um, treat one of our grazing allotments specifically to increase the area of forage for livestock. So I guess that one was definitely a little bit earlier on. And nowadays it's almost exclusively fire prevention efforts. So going out there and creating fire breaks, or just, we call it a fuels reduction. So just removing that woody material from the landscape to reduce the risk of a very severe fire, um, if that makes sense. The one picture I showed here, um, this was actually a habitat restoration project that I sort of spearheaded in our field office. And we did all that by hand, so it was definitely less destructive. But the idea behind this project specifically was to open up a little bit of this prairie habitat for things like native pollinators, and also to free up some water resources for a small intermittent stream that is just behind, I guess, the perspective of this photo.
Great. And Dominique makes a good point down in the chat. I think it's okay if everyone wants to turn on their videos now, and we can also raise hands. I want to grab these questions before we start taking new ones, just for the sake of that. But the next question is from Lori asking, is scale disease on the pinyon trees prevalent in our area?
Yeah, so that was something I didn't mention. Definitely a great question there. So I would say that we have occurrence of that, but it's pretty patchy. I wouldn't say that it's like super prevalent, but I've heard of like a few smaller areas down in Huerfano County that have had that disease. And it generally is pretty devastating to that forest stand. Um, so I guess, luckily for now, it's not that bad, but, looking forward with things like climate change, there definitely is a potential for that to get worse.
Thank you. And Gary's next asking, do Piñon Jays for colonies akin to rookeries of great blue herons, or are they more randomly dispersed in an old growth pinyon forest? Are you willing to share the location of some of these colonies?
Well, unfortunately, we haven't identified any of these colonies yet. Like I said, last fall was sort of the inception of our study, and nesting behavior occurs in the spring. So I'm not aware of any nesting colonies, but I bet, if you just go hike around and listen for these guys, you could probably find one, just keeping in mind, I don't think you walking around in there would really disturb them that much, but uh, it is possible that they'll abandon their nest sites if they, like say if a bulldozer rolls through or something like that. And then so the first part of that question, I guess I would say, so, they do have a high site fidelity, which means they'll return to the same colony sites year after year. And these are generally distributed on the landscape in areas that pinyon trees have produced a large mast that year. So, they do move around a little bit, but generally in the short term, they'll stick around the same areas. And definitely in the old growth pinyon forest, they really love that for nestings. It's a really complex habitat, so that sort of gives them a leg up as far as being detected by predators and things like that. And it's a little bit, generally, those trees are a little bit higher up, so they can escape some of that ground predation pressure. Um, I think I did mention this too, but the best spot for nesting for these guys, because they like to actually forage and cache their seeds in these more sparse open areas, will be like that juxtaposition of a very dense habitat forest type with something that may have been thinned or might just be sparse in general, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and moving down, we have a couple people with a similar question, wondering about the bird feeders. Is it okay to be feeding the Piñon Jay or not to feed them? Are we hurting them by loving them? Great questions. Also, some say that they scare off the other birds and are eating me out of house and home.
Yeah, so that's actually published in the literature that they will rely on things like backyard feeders and especially insects when there's like a low pinion mass that year. So I mean, like, aside from disease transmission, which we are not aware of at this point, I would say that's definitely fine. And I'm sure that, they kind of come and go as well. And they're not just living in your backyard. I'm sure maybe they live, in nearby forests as well.
Great, that's helpful. Just if anyone does need to go, since it's 8:03, I want to respect the time. I'm going to drop the link in the chat for our hike. So if anyone wants to click on that to then buy tickets, just a reminder that that date is February 20th. It's a Saturday. We'll leave early around 8. That's early for me, a Saturday, 8 to about noon. And I know Jordan was saying we could be there as early as sunrise to see some of these, but we'll probably leave around 8 o'clock to go out to Texas Creek. So there's the link there for anyone who wants that follow-up adventure. And then we can just keep on going. So our next question, I think what's probably best at this point, maybe Barbara, you're the next, and Wendy Gordon, we want to answer those questions, but Jordan, you can probably stop sharing your screen so we can all see each other at that point. And then if you all want to take yourselves off of not recording or stopping the video, and then we can kind of ask some questions in a little bit more of a personal way. So how about I just follow up with Wendy Gordon? She wanted to ask, and I see that you're there ready to go, Wendy, so go ahead. And you are muted.
Here, I think I just unmuted.
Yeah,
can you hear
great.
me? Okay. So I had a question. Obviously, it sounds like a lot isn't yet really understood about some of these fire mitigation practices, like the land management, trying to thin, clear different types of procedures, right? That seemed to be some of the takeaway here. At the same time, I can't help but reflect on, I know like Chaffee County's got this new kind of generalized blueprint for reducing wildfire risk in the county. And then you've got some of these new subdivisions like Centerville Ranch, which has a lot of pinyon pine, all over it. And in fact, if you merge those two sort of maps and blueprints, if you will, because I have, you see, okay, a high priority fire risk reduction area is in fact an area like Centerville Ranch where there's lots of pinyon. So I'm wondering going forward, how do we start to get some of this more some cases nuanced information to private landowners? Like maybe if you're going to do some sort of thinning, you don't do it right before the nesting season or into the nesting season, but more generally, the message out that pinyon pines are something to really value here and not just basically slash and burn.
Yeah, And that's the challenge, I guess. We have to try to come up with a solution to those issues. I guess it would really come down to somebody sitting down and talking to whoever's making those calls on, like the specific timing that they're going to do those thinning projects. And then just saying like, hey, go out there and do a Piñon Jay survey before you actually do this. If you don't find them there, if you don't find a colony, you can go ahead and do that, even if it is during their nesting season, if they're not there. And yeah, so really just trying to disseminate that information out there. But I guess more specifically to like how they're going to manage that habitat, I would recommend leaving the larger trees and creating sort of like a mock old growth pinyon forest if you could, take down the smaller ones, leave those larger ones that'll produce a lot of mast. Yeah, so, I'm not sure who sits on the board for that specific, fire mitigation plan. It's probably the NRCS, I would guess, is involved. So yeah, I would have no idea if they're even considering those things or not. I would guess not.
Yeah, and that's my kind of concern. So I think, I don't know, for me, one of the takeaways here is, aside from, going out and doing scientific research on the jays and their behaviors, but it also sounds like there's still a lot of very basic communication that potentially needs to happen, between and across partners and participants. And clearly folks are very interested in topics like fire mitigation right now, right? So making sure that it gets done well rather than in some sort of negative way, I think is a real opportunity.
I would agree with that. Yeah, it definitely is an opportunity. Yeah, it's a great point.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Jordan. The next question is from Barbara Tid, and then I think we'll just start taking people with their hands up, or however we want to do that. Barbara,
Okay.
if you're okay, I'm happy to read this for you, and then you can follow up with anything. She says, a few years ago, there was a mast in the old growth pinyons on the western side of the Sangre de Cristos between Garner Creek and Major Creek at about 8,500 feet elevation in Saguache County. Numerous pickers from a commercial company were harvesting pinyon nuts on BLM land, as were private individuals. The commercial pickers were picking up to 50+ gallon bags. Could this substantially affect availability of pinyon nuts for the Piñon Jay, or would this be inconsequential?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a concern that I didn't mention. I hadn't been aware of a large scale effort like that in our actual field office, but yeah, especially like, let's just say hypothetically that there was a colony of Piñon Jays that had nested there the year prior. And, maybe they were going to plan to nest there again, because I'm sure that they can key in on the fact that there's a big mast event there, right? So yeah, I mean, that's a pretty substantial like removal of those nutrients for Piñon Jays. And kind of like I mentioned before too, it's so important for them that it can actually, like if there was a late mast some year outside of their normal breeding season, it can actually kick them back into reproductive gear. So that they're keying in heavily on those mast events, and those can be pretty localized, like you said there. So I would say that's definitely a concern. I don't know if it really cause like a population extinction by itself or a population decline locally. But generally, if that happened a lot, you could see where, the additive effects might start to be a pretty big concern, I guess, if that makes sense.
Great question, Barbara. I think we can now open it up to anyone else who might have some questions. Yeah, Keith, go ahead.
My question, I think got skipped, but it was answered in previous questions about feeding, and I think you gave us permission to do that, basically. I'd like to know how the jays get into those. How do they crack that hard pinion shell? I like pinion nuts too, but it's just impossible
Yeah.
to build up a quantity to make it worthwhile.
It sure is, yeah. They just have like a really strong beak, believe it or not, and they'll kind of like grab it and hammer it against the tree to sort of get in there and break it up. And actually the process of caching them, so they'll go out there and store them in all kinds of different places, and the fact that they've been sort of like buried in some vegetation or underground a little bit with some more moisture softens the shells up a little bit for them. So generally when they come back to pick up that cache, it's a little bit easier to get into. As far as recommending you try that, I guess at your own discretion.
I even went online and to look for a pinion nut cracking machine, and they're not made. There's nothing available except a pair of needle nose pliers that I found. Just quick follow-up question. I get a pretty large group of Piñon Jays coming to my house right after the feeders are filled or the suet is put out. Do they just cruise around in their big groups? Do they have some sort of communication skills? Because I see one and then I see 30.
Yeah, they definitely have those communication skills. Think back to that sentinel behavior that they do, where they'll place a few individuals like way up in the tree. And if they see a predator, they'll sort of vocalize to the rest of the colony, and they'll either hide or take off. So I'm almost positive that they probably send out, individuals broadly. And if they do find food, they'll, potentially indicate that back to the rest of the group. But they do travel in flocks for sure. Like if you ever see them moving around, like you were just describing, there's usually a bunch of them. So it could be that they're just moving through, but I would say it's definitely possible that, they had a scout out there.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jackie, go ahead.
There we go. I'd like to follow up on what Wendy was saying. It sounds like in our area we need a education and advocacy group, like an organized one. Is there any chance of that happening through GARNA? Or
I like that idea.
Or anybody else have ideas? I think GARNA is the natural organization we have here.
Yeah, and I would say if we have some people willing to volunteer, that just makes it that much more possible. So yeah, absolutely. Let's get something going.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just to chime in on that, if that was something that any of you guys listening would get involved with, definitely feel free to contact me, for some more information, or, so maybe I could help you get a little bit of just that science across maybe more clearly to them if they're not really thinking about it that way. Or yeah, so I can throw my email in the chat here so you guys have it as well.
Thanks, Jordan. So the time now is 8:15, which feels good for wrapping up. Maybe we'll just have one more question if anyone has anything burning. Yeah, Wendy, go for it.
One additional climate change sort of follow-up. So, and I realize we're looking at older trees, more mature trees as being the ones ultimately that are, going to help the species. Is there evidence that the trees, the piñons are migrating to higher elevations? Obviously a lot of trees now are colonizing higher elevations. So is there range expansion to, the north here essentially? Actually both there could be physical range expansion, latitude, but also just going up the mountainside.
Yeah, so I would guess that they would generally follow the mast of the pinyon trees, so if it's really hot down low for 20 years or something like that, and it just wreaks havoc on the mast production in that area, it would make sense that the Piñon Jays would then move higher, where maybe during that late summer, the trees didn't experience that really high temperature that limited their mast. So I would say it would definitely be mitigated through the pinyon pine. But since they can obviously move very far, they have huge home ranges, right? It was like 4,000 hectares or something, like 15 square miles. I mean, that can encompass like a huge elevational range. So they're definitely adapted to be able to do that. And if we did observe that sort of a trend, I would guess that it would probably be related to the actual pinyon pine mast years.
Great questions, everyone. That was helpful for me too. So thank you for asking them. And thank you, Jordan, so much for all of this incredible, rich information. I am looking forward to going out in February and hopefully seeing some Piñon Jay. All of this is pretty new to me, so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm sure all of you saw that Dominique also just resent the link since it was getting a little far up in the chat. But that link will be available. We'll start promoting it more. It'll be in our Garna Gab through social media. So you'll be seeing that link in the future. And you'll be seeing Jordan out in the field with us that day as well. So it'll be a good follow-up, a good start. Great. Thank you, Jordan. And Dominique, do you have anything to add?
Jordan, thank you so much. That was really informative.
Yeah, thank you all so much for taking some time out of your day and learning about Piñon Jays. I obviously care about them a lot, and I'm sure you guys do as well. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any other questions. I'm always happy to talk about this kind of stuff. My email's in the chat there, and I hope to see some of you in February. And no promises, but hopefully we'll see a few Piñon Jays.
How come you were driving so much? Where'd you go?
Bye, everyone. Thank you for being
here.
Where's your dad? Oh, your dad was up in Louisville, right?
Oh, you're still muted, Dom.
Good job, Kelsey.
Oh, that was so nerve-wracking. That was my favorite. That was scary. So thanks.
There's a lot.
Hey,
yeah,
we already have like 5 people signed up for the hike.
great.
What should we cap it?
Yeah, I think we can't. I think we still can't do more than 10 people.
Could we do? Oh, Jordan wants to join us. I'll add him in. Maybe we could. Oh, let's see if he can join before I continue.
We can reach out to public health and see what the cap is supposed to be, because it was 10 and then it went, it got increased for businesses. So, but we wouldn't want to do more than probably 15 or 20 for a hike anyway.
Right. And my only other thought that could possibly be true is if you are feeling like really knowledgeable around Piñon Jay, which I just don't, but if you do, or if there is a second person that could, then maybe we have 2 groups of 10, something like that.
Yeah, and we can talk to Jordan about that and his availability. I don't know where he went. I thought he was coming back in, but
yeah, that was weird. But I don't have a cap on those tickets right now. So should we put one?
yeah.
How did you do that?
Let's see. I'll go ahead and share my screen and show you that.
I'm in the Piñon Jay under edit screen. Oh, purchase.
Maybe I'll have you share your screen.
Okay. Sharing my screen. Okay, so here I am.
Yeah, so keep going down. Down, down, down. Oh, go into those actions. Yep.
Edit ticket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we should have charged more money.
I know.
But it's good. This will give us good analytics too. So see that total tickets available.
Total tickets available. Aha. So should we say 10 for members and 10 for non-members, or
Yeah, that sounds good.
or 20 for members and none for non-members?
Yeah, we could do that. That's actually a really cool feature that we have the ability to do.
So maybe then we're only making a total of whatever 20 times 5 is in my mind right now. That's not
100.
Is that it? So we're only making $100 off this.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, the goal is really impact.
Did I say
I
something?
love that idea about a campaign, you know?
Did I do it like that for non-members so then people don't?
You have to join. You have to join to get a ticket. In fact, you might even put that in somewhere up top. This popular program is currently open to members only. I would put currently so people know that might change just in case it doesn't fill.
No. Okay, there we go. Okay, so control copy. Does this need to live anywhere else?
I love that we have the ability to change this so fast.
Yeah, this is amazing. Okay, so then I'll save this before any non-members try to get in there.
Something that I've been thinking about is that we need to also check. And maybe this is something we can start to do once our third staff person comes on, and that's more of a communication thing where like we need to check and make sure that everybody who claims to be a member actually is. You know, we don't actually have a check within our system.
Karma checks.
Exactly. So, but it's worth it once in a while just to reach out and say, hey, we noticed that you think you're a member. Would you like to renew?
Oh, look at that. So it looks like sold out for non-members. So they have some GARNA members. Cool.
Great.
Okay, I think that looks good. Cool. Anything else?
No, that was a good program. I think 40 is really good attendance for a Zoom program. So
agreed. And once his video was clearer, everything made so much more sense to me. I felt like I couldn't hear him.
I know, I feel really bad about that because you either have to choose the sound or the quality of the PowerPoint, I guess. But.
Oh well, everyone else seems really happy.
Yeah, we'll see what the recording looks like.
Oh yeah.
I'm still recording. Oops.